Welcome, everyone, to the League of Women Voters of Piedmont's discussion on the new models for social justice and police reform question and answer. I'm Laurel Plimier, the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont, and we're grateful for everyone who was able to take the time out of your day to be with us today virtually here this afternoon. If you are on the Zoom call, please leave yourself muted for the duration of the event to minimize background noise and so that we can hear our speakers. You can post your questions anytime during the presentation by using the chat feature in the Zoom, or if you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can write a comment to the live stream. And we'll answer as many questions. I will ask questions to the speakers after their presentations. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Lois, who is going to need to unmute. There she goes. Who will introduce our speakers today.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is a really exciting program, and I'm just thrilled to be able to introduce Chief Bowers, our police chief in Piedmont, and Nancy Pianati, our former league president, and she's a supervising attorney for the Attorney General's office. I'm going to do a short summary of all their experience and their accomplishments because they are quite lengthy. Prior to coming to Piedmont, Chief Bowers worked in San Jose. He was awarded the Mover of Mountains Award in Public Safety and Community Bridge Building by the Dr. Martin Luther King Association of Santa Clara Valley. And he also was instrumental in forming the Chiefs Community Advisory Board. He earned his undergraduate degree at San Jose State, and then he earned his master's degree in criminology, law, and society from UC Irvine. His wife is a sergeant with Santa Clara, and their parents have 3 children, and they live in Oakland. Nancy has spent her entire professional life working on equity issues, particularly with regards to law enforcement. She represented numerous state agencies that engage in law enforcement, including the California Highway Patrol, Office of the Inspector General, and the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. She supervised the creation of the regulations implementing the Race and Identity Profiling Act of 2015, and is overseeing the Racial and Identity Profiling Advisory Board, which today has published 3 annual reports regarding racial and identity profiling in California. In addition, she's responsible for managing multiple police practice investigations, and collaborative reform initiatives with law enforcement on behalf of the State Attorney General. I've had the pleasure of working with Chief Bauer and ABC, and working with Nancy as part of the League of Women Voters Board. I'm thrilled to have them both to us today.
Well, thank you, Lois.
Yes, thank you very much, Lois.
I think she cut out. Oh, there she is. Okay.
So it's my understanding, Chief, that that we are going to be doing a 15-minute sharing, you and and I think you were slated to go first, and then Laurel is going to take questions from the audience. So please feel free to start.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, Nancy. So I just want to say good afternoon to everybody, and I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Piedmont for the opportunity to talk today on this critical topic of police reform. I think during our conversation, and I saw that I have 15 minutes. I'm not sure I'm going to take up that entire time, nor do I know if you want to listen to me for that entire time. And I'm very interested in your questions. But I think to start out during this conversation about reforms, it's important for us to understand kind of the current state of affairs in our own local community to the extent that we can. I know there's a national conversation about law enforcement going on right now, but really law enforcement, it's really a local endeavor between a police department and the community and the public that it serves locally. I'm sure there's, laws, statutory regulations and whatnot that exist, but at its core, it's a very local relationship. So let me start by just talking about the fact that my department, the killing of George Floyd at the hands, again, of 4 police officers, to me stands as a clarion call to action, and really requires us in law enforcement to acknowledge it, really not as a singular event, but as a latest example of a historical pattern of misuse of force and really, quite frankly, larger issues of inequity in our country. So it's with this understanding, I think, that we as chiefs, as practitioners, really need to look inward and make some careful assessments to ensure that we're really employing, policies and procedures in training to support the safest outcomes for the public, and by the public, all of the public, not just some segments of the public. So, and we also need to make sure we're doing those things for the safest outcomes for our police officers as well. Really, I, as the chief in my department, we really own our responsibility in this awakening that's really happened in our nation. And I don't think we can just say and sit back and, thinking that we're in California and just say, this could never happen in Piedmont. What happened in Minnesota can never happen in Piedmont, or some of these things that we've seen. We can't assume that, and we can't expect you as the public to assume that. It's really bigger than that. So our department here in Piedmont has been talking about bias, race, and these issues long before the recent tragic deaths. And really, we've instituted some policy changes. But again, this time I think requires us, regardless of those past efforts, to continue to look even harder inside and internally. I'll just continue by just talking about the fact that we have, on the outset of what happened about a month ago now, we received several inquiries relative to our use of force policies, and specifically those generated by the Campaign Zero's 8 Can't Wait project that exists. Several of you may have heard or learned about the 8 Can't Wait, but our department provided a point-by-point response to each of those recommendations, and you can find that on our Piedmont Police Department website in our transparency portal. The intent of providing this information to the public is to assist the community in its understanding of what our current policies and practices are. What do we do with training, relative use of force, and really just to kind of highlight that. So the 8 areas in the 8 Can't Wait, for those who aren't familiar with the specific areas, it talks about banning chokeholds and strangleholds, requiring de-escalation, requiring warnings before shooting, requiring exhausting of all alternatives before shooting, ensuring that there's a duty to intervene within the organization, banning shooting at moving vehicles, requires the use of force continuum, and requires comprehensive reporting. So I urge folks to go to our website and take a look at those things and look at our responses. In some instances, we have directly addressed some of those things. In other instances, such as the continuum, there's some differences of opinion with that in terms of what should be in place with the use of force policy. And really, I think in terms of looking at semantics, there's some just practitioner differences with how the terms are used in terms of continuum of force versus, implementing policies that talk about reasonableness and whatnot. So I have one of the things I just, to clear out, one of the things that we did on the front end of this is locally tangible things that we've done is I suspended indefinitely the use of the carotid hold. And that was done subsequent to the governor's direction to police officer standards and training. It's called POST, which is a regulatory body that exists that oversees police training and different standards of hiring and whatnot. But it was evident to me that, based off what I saw and the fact that, what took place, I suspended that hold. And I'll be quite candid, that was a difficult decision to make in some respects because, if it's between that hold and having to use deadly force, obviously we'd prefer to use that hold now. And again, when we talk about chokeholds versus, a carotid restraint, there's some technicalities there, but at the end of the day, what I saw was just, a need to take that affirmative action so that we can have an opportunity to have some time to assess from a policy perspective, what our current policy says with respect to the hold, and then just have an opportunity to look at, hey, is there some other best practices that may exist where, an officer is in that crisis moment in time where they have to use some type of hold because they're defending their life. And is there an opportunity to look at some other best practices that they can employ as opposed to that hold? So, again, it was a tough decision to make because there are realities. There are times when officers are in literally a life and death struggle for their own life, and I would hate to put one of my officers in a position where I'm putting their life in danger by a decision I'm making. But at the same time, again, we also have to be cognizant that we're putting by the decisions we're making, we're putting other folks, public's life in danger as well. So those are the decisions that is why I get paid the big bucks, I guess. So in addition to that, I think one of the things that's interesting to talk about is, I don't think use of force in Piedmont's something that most people have a lot of insight on or spend a lot of time thinking about. And so I think it's probably a good use of time just to kind of talk about that a little bit with you today. So as I mentioned, we've, as some people may know, we are required, well, let me just back up. Let me just provide some context. So on an annual basis, our police department averages somewhere in the area of about 13,000 calls for service a year. And since 2015, which is when basically there's an assembly bill, I believe it was 71, requiring reporting of certain types of use of force. So since 2015, the Piedmont Police Department has averaged about 4 uses of force events annually during that time frame. So again, about 13,000 calls for service annually, and again, we average about 4 uses of force a year as well. The majority of those uses of force are low-level control holds and things such as that. We've had 1 use of force event this year in 2020, and it was with respect to a control hold and somebody being handcuffed. All of the uses of force events that we've had in that time frame that I just described to you were found to be in policy. And in addition to that, that state law that I mentioned in our reporting, when we have to report serious, either officer-involved shootings, or if somebody is killed or seriously injured, has if their injury results in great bodily injury, we have to report that to the state. And since the beginning of that requirement, AB 71, again, I believe it is, we've had no reportable events of those types in our city and our police department. So it's a good track record, but again, that's something that we continually train on, and to the best of our ability in taking advantage of things that are in our control, we try and avoid those situations. The topic of officer involved shootings has obviously been something that's been talked about and discussed. And so the topic of who conducts an investigation of officer involved shootings is an area, obviously, which again has garnered a lot of attention. We started initiating a policy change in this area probably about a year ago. And it started with conversations that I was having, and really thoughts and concerns I was having Having come from a much larger agency where there is just, a lot more activity and a lot more expertise, quite frankly, with investigating officer-involved shootings and things such as that, to it coming here where not only was there just, fortunately, we don't have a community where there's opportunity for a lot of officer-involved shootings and investigations of, assault with deadly weapons and shootings in general. That's a good thing, but on the other end of it, we don't have that expertise, that professional expertise. And in addition to that, it's a bandwidth issue in terms of my thinking of concern with respect to us investigating those events here. What I mean by that is basically, our department's a small department. We have 31 total people, 21 sworn officers. I have, 13 officers in the field and 2 investigators. My investigators periodically work over.
I think we've lost your audio.
Oh. Can you hear me?
No,
Can you hear me now?
you can hear?
I can
Okay,
hear
so
you.
maybe it's just me. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. All right. I was talking about officer involved shootings, and basically my concern was just the size of our department, but also looking at it from the standpoint of thinking about a small department at our size conducting our own officer involved shootings and the optics of that. And so with that, had conversations with the sheriff's office to see if they would be open to discussing an agreement where they would come in and conduct the criminal investigation of the officer's action in an officer-involved shooting. Now, obviously, the district attorney's office also is involved in those investigations, but having the sheriff's office also come in to be another, to be the kind of the law enforcement investigative body versus the DA's versus our department doing that was something that we began talks about, again, like I said, about a year ago. And at the beginning of May, we we actually started policy changes in that respect. And so we're still involved in policy changes and drafts and talking with our city attorney's office, our union, and the sheriff's office. So that's an area that we're looking at right now as well, of changing. Now, obviously, legislatively, there's some things that are being talked about at the state level and even nationally in terms of about, establishing other independent bodies to conduct, officer involved shootings and in some circumstances, in custody deaths and other investigations. And I'll just tell you from my point of view as a chief, I'd absolutely be open to the independent investigation of those events. The reason we're going with who we're going with now is because pretty much that's what's available. But if there are other options out there, I think, I think at least I'll talk for myself as a chief, that absolutely open to looking at those other opportunities to conduct those types of investigations. So this proposed policy change is in line with guidance from entities such as the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and it's consistent with the findings of the President's Task Force on 21st century policing, and that was President Obama's task force that he commissioned during his administration to look at several areas of best practices. So formal discussions on the establishment of an MOU with the county began in earnest at the beginning of May, as I said. And again, we're still completing our draft policies with that and working through those technical aspects. So now more than ever, law enforcement agencies' use of force policies and procedures and training are being scrutinized with calls for substantive change. And obviously, federal, state, and local government leaders have proposed reforms seeking to reduce the use of excessive force and increase accountability and transparency of law enforcement. And so it's interesting. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. There's about 330 municipal police chiefs in the state of California. And that's just municipal police chiefs. That's not talking about school police or transit districts or anything like that, just city police chiefs. There's about 330. Out of that 330, there's 16 who are African-American. And of those 16, well, actually technically 17, of those 17, one is a Black female. and she's an interim chief in Richmond. And so those are interesting numbers when you think about that and the dynamics that we're in. So on Friday, June 19th, a number of us of that 16 organized and went to the state capitol to conduct a press conference where we addressed the historical role of law enforcement, the historical role law enforcement has played regarding race and policing. We also provided recommendations for real change in the area of training, public areas of the Public Safety Bill of Rights, or POBAR, which is a governing mandates basically that require certain things, protections for police officers and personnel matters. And also calls for, and also address the calls for the defunding of the police department. So we addressed several of those things up in Sacramento. We met with the Attorney General. I actually had lunch with them for about an hour because almost an hour and a half. We had a little bit of slow food service at the restaurant we went to. So, but it was a good opportunity to talk with him. And also met with the legislative secretary, legislative affairs secretary for the governor. Governor was very interested in speaking with our group. We couldn't make it work that day. He had time for us in the afternoon, but we couldn't stay, and he didn't have time in the morning. Obviously, he's a little bit busy. But we are working on a meeting with the governor in the next couple weeks. He heard about us coming up in our perspectives, and again, as he works with the legislators, we're a perspective that he's interested in talking to, and obviously us with him. So look forward to that conversation coming up. I think it's the second week in July is what we're eyeing right now. So while at the state's capitol, I discussed in my portion of the press conference was discussing, kind of training high level in some just areas of focus. And so I discussed the fact that policies and training provide, the critical framework for seeking the safest outcomes in use of force incidents for the public and for officers. But the culture we maintain is really the foundation. So if you have a culture that's devoid, of an understanding of the impact of bias, and you have a culture that's devoid of an understanding of the historical context and the current day inequities, that exist, that's going to keep us in this negative feedback loop that we're in right now, that we're all caught in policing and with force and with equity issues. And I think there's obviously larger society issues that we're keenly aware of. So we basically were calling for, or I was calling for, when I went up there, for increased training from the academy, from the time of the officers in the academy through the rest of their law enforcement career, in areas of implicit bias and its impacts on policing, on areas of the historical implications of race in policing, and also talking about contemporary relational inequity issues of race, society, and policing. So looking at it from the standpoint of the history and how we got to where we're at, because that's absolutely important to understand as a police officer, understanding the historical nature of the way things are and why they are what they are, but also understanding current day, how things exist in just thinking about it at a higher level. I think it's so very important. And I think, quite frankly, we don't do a good job about in that regard in policing currently with our current, I think we try to get there. I think, Post is one of the best police officer standards and training entities in the country. And I think California law enforcement from a training perspective is in some instances heads and shoulders, but there's still a ways to go. In addition, we talked about those major areas in training. We talked about a little bit too. So, again, our department, we understand that we are in a dynamic time, and this is only the first step in a larger conversation about policing. Use of force and equity in our larger society is, these are only beginning steps, and our department understands that, and I understand that. There's a lot of work to do that needs to be done, but one of the things I've talked to my organization about is the fact that we've got to be very resilient, and we've got to understand and be open to engage in this work, and to be comfortable being uncomfortable about having conversations and challenging our assumptions, and really being open to different ways of doing things and thinking about things. So we stand committed to engage in that work with you, our community, and with our region and in our country.
Thank you, Chief Bowers. We appreciate your comments. And we will have questions after Nancy Beninati finishes her presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Chief. Laurel, I am going to need you to pull up that PowerPoint, if that's okay, because
Sure.
I didn't cue it soon enough. So thank you all. I'm going to talk a little bit about, as Lois mentioned, I work in the California Attorney General's office. The last 14 years, I've focused on civil rights for the Attorney General. And with the last, say, 5 years, I've focused on constitutional policing issues. If we want to just go to the next slide. Some of the work that we do at the Attorney General's office is actually quite multifaceted. We do work on reform efforts of police departments by conducting investigations and doing collaborative reform. And I'll talk about those a little bit more in detail in a second. But we also do law enforcement bulletins, and those are directives that the Attorney General issues to law enforcement to help them as a tool, for example, if a new law comes out. This year, the use of force policy in the state was changed by AB 392. And so we worked on a law enforcement bulletin that would explain to all law enforcement agencies in the state, basically what the new law is and what that policy is, or what the law is and how they should implement it. We do community outreach like we're doing today. Last year, we were able to do a Know Your Rights with the Department of Motor Vehicles. So if you get pulled over, there's now a little blurb in the pamphlet about what you should do and what you shouldn't do when you get pulled over by the police. And then as Chief was mentioning, POST is the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training. They're a separate state agency. We work very closely with them in a couple of contexts with the Racial Identity Profiling Board, and also in our capacity just as working on these policing issues. Last week, I participated in a 2-day workshop with POST, for POST in developing the use of force guidelines that POST is going to publish in light of new laws that were enacted this year. And then the last thing, and it's a big chunk, is the Racial Identity Profiling Act. The Attorney General's office was responsible for drafting regulations on how law officers will collect data on all the stops that they conduct in the state of California. And I led that project. And I'm also working with the Racial Identity Profiling Board, which develops annual reports that contain issues about policy. The next one, please. So as I mentioned, pattern and practice investigation is one of the ways in which our office evaluates law enforcement agencies. You may hear a lot about this. This is kind of what the US DOJ did in Ferguson. And a pattern and practice investigation is one where we investigate to determine whether the law enforcement agency has engaged in a pattern and practice that violates individuals' civil rights. So that is more of a top to bottom review. And then collaborative reform is a relatively new way of looking at how to work with police on how to reform policy. And in collaborative reform, we actually work together with the law enforcement agency to identify problem areas and then focus our resources and expertise in reforming the policies, practices, and trainings. And so the focus is more on adopting best practices, whereas pattern and practice is more to find violations of law. The next one, please. Just go to the next one if I pause, Laura. Thank you. And so here are the differences in the pattern and practice versus collaborative reform. So, we do top to bottom reviews, we look at policies, use of force reports, IA investigations, citizen complaints. And like I said, the goal is to really find if there's a legal cause of action against that agency. If there are violations of law, then we usually try to settle the case with that agency and enter into a consent decree. And then the progress that the agency makes over time is then monitored by a police practices expert and overseen by the court. Those can take several years. I think Oakland has been under a consent decree for at least 20 or so years, it seems like. Whereas collaborative reform really bypasses that investigative stage. We work with the agency to develop policies that's better suited to the organization, and they take ownership of the reform efforts. It also seeks to instill the change in policing culture through policy and reform goals that are really derived from that law enforcement agency, but with independent oversight by the DOJ. So I just wanted to show you one example of what the collaborative reform initiative looks like. So we are doing collaborative reform with San Francisco Police Department. You may recall that they had a series of very high profile officer involved shootings. Mario Woods is the one that most people are familiar with. There were also some very high profile racist texts that were going through the department. So following US DOJ came in and did an evaluation. And then when the US DOJ pulled out under Donald Trump, the California Attorney General's office stepped in. But where collaborative reform has really seen a significant improvement in San Francisco is that you'll see that they made significant revisions to their use of force policy in 2016. And really a critical piece was having input from the community. And you see the numbers. There were 8 officer involved shootings in 2013, 8 in 2014, and 9 in 2015. So their policy now promotes the ideal that officers should all protect the sanctity of life, that officers must carry out their duties in a fair and unbiased manner. And then, among other things, the policy prohibits the use of chokeholds, including the carotid hold. It requires officers to use de-escalation. There's a duty to intervene. They need to engage in crisis intervention if there's somebody having a mental health crisis. And it requires officers to, use the minimal amount of force necessary to effectuate arrest. Next one, please. And because of what San Francisco did with regard to its policies, we've seen some significant progress. Chief mentioned Campaign Zero. One of the findings that Campaign Zero made was that police departments that actually implement more restrictions on the police use of force actually kill significantly fewer civilians. San Francisco PD went 18 months without a single officer involved shooting. Last year in December, they had 1 non-fatal officer involved shooting that did result in injuries. And then this year they had a discharge of a firearm, but no one was actually hit. So, and then all use of force overall incidents dropped by 24% in 2019. And that's down from 47% since 2016, which is when they implemented this new use of force policy. I'm going to now shift quite abruptly to the Racial Identity Profiling Act. because it's another way that the Attorney General's office has focused on policing and reducing bias and focusing more on constitutional aspect. The next slide, please. So the Racial and Identity Profiling Act is a way to determine whether or not individuals are being stopped according to their race, ethnicity, gender, LGBT status. And it looks at every stop that is made by an officer or a search. So I mentioned the criteria, but the stops are based on the way that information is recorded is based upon the officer's perception. So it doesn't actually have to be a person in a particular demographic. It is based on what the officer perceives that person to be. Often people may pull over someone and believe that they are, I don't know, if somebody pulled me over and they thought I was 25, they would put that down as opposed to my actual age, which I will not disclose. So, and then the Racial Identity Profiling Act also, as I mentioned earlier, created the advisory board. And that board is really a unique board. There's 19 members. It's made up of members of law enforcement, the commissioner of the CHP, academics, and members of the community. So the DOJ's work with regard to RIPA, we were responsible for drafting the regulations. So every time an officer pulls someone over, when they fill out a stop data report, they are basically filling out all the information that the legislature prescribed and in the manner in which the Department of Justice has either added additional elements or told them and clarified the types of things that they need to record. We work on the annual reports, and the reports are really very comprehensive. They're meant to be documents that people can look to for policy on not just bias in policing, but how about civilian complaints and other really important aspects that community members and law enforcement should be able to use in order to improve community and police relations. And then the reports, last year's report was the first time where we actually collected the stop data. So the data was not initially collected until July of 2018. And the top largest agencies in California were the ones that were the first to collect that data. And so the reports will analyze that data and then determine trends that will eventually inform policy. And I think in my next slide, I have a little bit of that information that I wanted to share from last year's report. So in 2020, we looked at 6 months of data because that was what was available to us. It's reported by the law enforcement agencies now in a year-long increment, but it's due, it's sort of like complete on December 31st, but then not due to the Department of Justice until April. So our reports are gonna lag a little bit, but this is the current data. So one of the things that I thought was maybe of particular interest, so this data represents just the number of stops made for the 8 largest agencies in California. And the American Community Survey information is basically the build out. It's the census data for those 8 jurisdictions. And so one of the things, if you compare in looking specifically at, for example, the Black population for those that were stopped, Black individuals made up 6.3% of the population, but were stopped 15.1% of the time. And the only other demographic group that demonstrated a disproportionate amount of stops were Middle Eastern and South Asians, where they represented 1.8% of the population, but were stopped 4.4% of the time. And the next slide builds upon this model. Again, officers search Black individuals at a rate 2.9 times than that of white individuals. And so, as I mentioned, the information doesn't just capture the stop, but it captures the search. And so for Black individuals, this bar graph represents 100% of the people who were stopped, and 18.7% of all Black people stopped were searched, whereas the number for white individuals was 6.5%. And then this graph shows search yield rates. So search yield rates are, essentially when an officer then decides to search someone, have they discovered contraband or evidence? And so of those individuals that were searched, Black individuals were less likely to have contraband discovered than the white individuals. And so as you can see from this progression, the data, at least in this data set, seems to show what the African-American community has been saying, all along, that the African-American individuals, at least in this data set, were stopped at a greater rate than white or other individuals based upon their population. They were then searched at higher rates. And even though they were searched at higher rates, they weren't more likely to have contraband or evidence on them at the time that they were searched. And so I know that the League of Women Voters and everyone on this call really wants to know what can they do to make a difference. So, I really urge everyone to hold our chief accountable, and any other chief. Alameda County, we're also, members of Alameda County, and we have members that are in Oakland as well. But really hold the police department accountable. Attend community meetings. I think it's great that the chief is looking into, getting rid of some reforms. The Attorney General actually released a list of 8 objectives that he would like law enforcement, I think it was 8, similar to the 8 Can't Wait campaign. Go to the department's website. I went to it. I had some trouble finding some stuff that I'll probably email the chief about later. But can you understand what is up there? And if not, I know this is a very open city that is very open to suggestions. So make that known. And then demand transparency. One thing that you can do, and you shouldn't be afraid to do, is to ask for public records. Just to know what kind of stuff is going on. SB 1421 allows people to make Public Records Act requests for the first time for incidents involving a police officer, if they've been involved in a shooting or serious bodily injury, or if they've been the subject of an investigation involving sexual assault or dishonesty. So that you should feel comfortable doing that and not be afraid. And file a citizen complaint if you believe that you've been treated unfairly, because many of the chiefs that I've met with, they want to know if their officers are not acting in accord with the standards that they want them to be acting. And then I just also want to put out openjustice.com. It's actually openjustice.doj.ca.gov. It has the use of force data, arrest data, and a whole bunch of other information that you can look at, not just Piedmont, but for the entire state. And then, please take a look at these RIPA reports. And the board is always looking for community engagement. All of our meetings are now going to be via Zoom. Well, we use Blue Jeans, but it'll be more accessible to people. But we really welcome public comment and would be really interested in having additional participants who have great ideas. And so with that, I will turn it back to Laurel, because I could probably talk for another like 45 minutes.
Thank you, Nancy. So we do have a bunch of questions. I'll start with one that addresses the types of calls, complaints that are made within Piedmont, and how many of them involve the caller reporting suspicious activity from people of color, and how those calls are handled within the department. And maybe Nancy can talk briefly about whether that rises at all to the level of RIPA reporting. I suspect it doesn't. Go ahead, Jeremy, I'll let you speak on that one.
Okay, thank you, Laurel. So we have what's called a computer aided dispatch system. We call it CAD for short. And what that system does is it captures all the data, information that we receive when somebody calls into our police department. And so what we're in the process of, because this isn't the first time that somebody's brought up the inquiry about, what calls are we getting from the community, and are these calls based on, what are they based on? And so we don't currently track that as a report in terms of, so for instance, a call where somebody is only reporting basically that somebody black or brown is walking through my neighborhood, and what my dispatchers sometimes will talk to me about is, the person just doesn't look like they belong here. I'm putting air quotes, doesn't look like they belong here. And so to the degree to which we get those versus, somebody calling in because they're observing legitimate suspicious activity that's related to a crime, and the person happens to be of a certain race or whatever, and that they're just providing that description as not the focal point of what they're calling in on, but just as one describing feature, so that the officers have a clearer picture on who's involved in what illicit or potentially illicit activity. So I don't have data on that in terms of rates. I'll tell you that what we are doing though is we are in the process, my staff is in the process of looking at what existing reports we can get out of our current systems to understand that data and to pull that data out so we can start getting to some of those answers. It's not so we're in the process of that. Later in July, we're actually commissioning our vendor to come out and specifically see about drilling down into some of that data and looking at different ways we can pull that out, particularly in a way that's consumable by the public. Because, Nancy brought up OpenGov, the website, and sometimes some of that data, you look at it and your eyes start crossing. So is it being pulled out in a way that is understandable and can facilitate honest discussions from a community standpoint? So we're in the process of getting to some of those answers, because flat out, we periodically get calls where, and our dispatchers are trained in that as well. Let me just kind of back up that, when we get a call for service, our dispatchers are trained to elicit certain information from people, and they do it for a multitude of reasons. So if we get a call of a suspicious person that's, walking in a neighborhood, and the person who's calling us isn't giving us articulable facts about what the person is doing that is raising their suspicion, the dispatchers are trained to elicit that information. And they do that because, number one, they want to be able to provide that information to the police officer, because if the person's doing something, like carrying a weapon or, trying to open a car door or whatever, that gives the officers, that gives us what the legal basis for us on contacting the person is. It gives us information in terms of what they're doing, that in terms of why we're contacting them. from an officer safety standpoint, I want my officers to know if somebody is, carrying a weapon, or, about to break into a home. So, because that will dictate how we respond. If we have a call that somebody is, in the process of breaking into somebody's home and they're there, we're going to want to get there to, intercede, so somebody isn't harmed. So they're trained to elicit all that information. One of the conversations we've been having inside the department is, and again, culturally, this department is sensitized to be very responsive to the community. That, there's a saying, no call is too small. Well, I'll submit to you that there are some calls that are too small. And quite frankly, what we've been talking about is, if we have a call from a resident or a member of the public, and they're providing information on an individual, and they can't articulate a cause for us going there, so for instance, I'll play it out for you. I see an individual walking down the street, they happen to be, if a black male walking down the street, and the dispatcher is inquiring in terms of, okay, well, what are they doing that's suspicious, or that's criminal in nature, or that's suspicious to you? And the person can't articulate it, well, they're not doing anything. They're just walking. They don't like it. They belong here. Okay. When we get those calls, the conversation we've been having is, we're not going to go to that call. That we'll put it out as what we term beat information. And that's just being aware that this call came in, this person reported this, but understanding that we have the discretion to not respond to that call and contact that person, because there's no reason to. It's not against the law to walk down the street, period. And so now somebody is now understanding that these things are often operate in the gray, in some instances, I'll be honest with you. I had an event where it was reported that somebody was doing something. I was literally around the corner from the call and decided to respond myself. And I pulled around within, literally seconds, and the person was not doing what was being reported to our dispatch. And so does that happen? Yes, it does happen. And I didn't contact the person. I drove by, saw that they weren't engaged in it, updated communications and the other responding officers, and kept on driving. But those are some of the techniques and strategies that we actually train on, in terms of how we respond to some of those potentially bias-based calls.
Yeah, thank you, Chief. It sounds like you have a good handle on that. So that's called bias by proxy, where the individual who's making this call for service has a preconceived potential bias against the person they're calling. And in last year's racial identity profiling report, we addressed and made recommendations to departments on how to incorporate bias by proxy training for dispatchers and for law enforcement on how to respond to those kind of calls, and how to educate the public who are making those calls why that would not be a cause to send someone on a call. San Francisco Police Department, we've been working very closely with them. They're on the precipice of adopting the first bias-based anti-bias policing policy that incorporates bias by proxy in the state of California. And so, this is really kind of cutting edge stuff. And then Laurel, to your question about racial identity profiling reports. So Piedmont doesn't start collecting until 2022. It's on a graduated scale depending on the size of your agency. But if there were a call for service that an officer was dispatched to, and they did end up detaining that individual, they would have to fill out a stop data report on that individual, even if it's a call for service. If they don't go to that call, then they don't have to fill anything out.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, Nancy. And I thought it was 2023 with our size, but I may be mistaken. But the bottom line with that is there is no prohibition for agencies going earlier. And so one of the things that we're talking about, and I'm talking about the RIPA reporting, one of the things that we've been talking about and that I've basically put out as a mandate is that we're going to be going early. So we're looking right now as a goal to start reporting probably sometime around the fall. as Nancy knows, there's a lot of technical aspects with reporting in terms of platforms you're going to use to input the data on and then submit that over to DOJ and et cetera. And there's a lot of due diligence that needs to be done. So there's some systematic things that we need to stand up internally. But my goal is to go early before 2022 or 2023, whichever is the deadline.
It's 2022.
I trust you.
Start January 1st and work by April 1st of 2023.
So the point of the matter is that we're looking to go early, just because really it's I think it's the responsible thing to do. And one of the things as well is the stops. It's not just related to proactive stops. It's any stop that's related. It could be a call for service. So somebody reports a specific type of crime, and we're being called to that event. It's not a proactive stop per se, but it's a stop associated to the call for service. It also is tracking that information as well.
Thank you. So we are surrounded by Oakland, and Oakland police have had a somewhat violent response to some of the recent protests. And there are questions about how whether Piedmont gets involved with Oakland police business ever, given our proximity, and what kind of commitment we could make to not provide mutual aid in a situation where there is police violence that our community finds unacceptable.
Sure. So we did send officers into mutual aid when the looting and the violence was going on in Oakland. Obviously, there was a lot of peaceful protests as well. So we did send officers. None of our officers that responded, actually received an inquiry about this. None of our officers that responded to the mutual aid request that came from Oakland participated in any use of force or utilization of any of the spray, tear gas, or any of that type of stuff. Quite frankly, they didn't go with those munitions, and they wouldn't discharge those munitions. Mutual aid is an area where, my philosophy on our relationships with our county partners is that we need to have good relationships with our county partners. I think that, and the bottom line with that is when we've had events, we, by the nature of our size, may have to rely on the assistance of agencies, whether it's for a criminal event that happens, a massive criminal event that happens, or a catastrophic event that happens. So we need to maintain healthy relationships with our law enforcement partners. Now, if one of our law enforcement partners has a pattern of practice or exhibits an inability to appropriately discharge their duties, I have no interest in partnering with them. And so I know right now, a lot of things are being looked at in terms of after action reports with use of force events that happened during the protests and the rioting and the looting. So I will keep a close eye on that to see, what practices were used in that. And then in addition, obviously, we're talking right now about looking at standardizing responses to crowd control situations and instituting, statewide standards in terms of those responses. So as long as an agency is adhering to those standards and the ethical and proper use of those items, I will be an advocate of answering the call of mutual aid as long as I have confidence in the agency's use, that it's going to be proper and appropriate. And obviously, if I don't have that confidence, I won't send our people.
Okay, I want to try to sneak in one more question if you have another couple minutes, and then we'll wrap up. Are there police responsibilities that you would like to see removed or changed in the context of defunding the police? And is that something that has been specifically addressed within Piedmont?
Okay, sorry, I was muted. So the answer is yes. I think historically, when you look at, the police department is one of the only agencies, one of the only entities in government, period, that will respond to anything that they are called to. There's no other agency that's going to respond to anything that they're called to other than police departments. And quite frankly, we're starting to see those chickens come home to roost because we've had less than adequate funding in other areas, whether it be mental health, homelessness issues, education, our education system. When you look at substance abuse and issues dealing with folks who are addicted to drugs. I mean, we see clear underfunding in those areas. And it's quite frankly been left to officers to go there. And again, understanding that when you come to look at police departments in our staffing and funding, you're going to see that most departments are going to tell you that they are not adequately staffed and whatnot. So what I would say is that yes, absolutely. If there's an opportunity to look at an investment in mental health crisis response, that there's a look to invest in homeless outreach, in immediacy responses, in increasing those capabilities, in terms of those types of things, absolutely. I would be wonderful. It'd be wonderful to see some of those disciplines, step up and be supported to be able to have those capabilities. I think the reality is we also need to understand that none of those things happen in a vacuum. I think thinking about things academically is one thing. Responding to them in the real world is quite another. And the fact that there's always going to be some crossover potentially. And so we need to ensure that we need to just understand the reality that the fact that even if the police get out of those businesses as being the primary responders, they're going to have some level of competency in those areas, because just by the nature of violence that sometimes can happen in those entities. I mean, homeless people are homeless, but they still have issues that affect them in their lives that they need police response for. And so we just need to understand that. I think in our county, I'm looking forward to later this month, there's a county program called, I believe it's CAT, where basically there's going to be different responses and transportations for folks with mental health issues. Doesn't quite go to the level that I'm looking for in terms of having an actual clinician respond. And there are some of those programs that exist in Oakland, but the availability in them is lacking. They're only open at certain times of the day, and they're just not enough of them. And so we need more of that. And the last thing I'll say about defunding is, I think a lot of things that we're talking about reinvesting on, it's going to take time. It's going to take time for the effects of, should society put a premium on investing in these areas, it's going to take time for the results to bear themselves out. And I think it would be very dangerous to certain communities for us to, expect change to happen overnight in terms of investments in these communities, and then also take away the historical immediate the agency that's immediately responds to provide those services in terms of defunding the police. So what I mean, but I just basically think that we need to be cognizant of, when we talk about defunding, I think clearly, stepping back and looking at how we're investing and is it smart, we should absolutely be doing that. But we also need to be careful of not cutting things too quickly or too substantially, because there could be unintended consequences.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We obviously weren't able to get to all the questions, but I want to honor everyone's time and not go over too long. So thank you to Police Chief Jeremy Bowers and California Department of Justice Attorney Nancy Bonatti for taking the time to be with us today. And I also want to give a special thank you to Jennifer Trainer and Julie Chang, who are our program chairs, and to the entire program committee for putting this event together on short notice and over the summer when we're often usually not doing much of anything in the league. So things are different this year, and unprecedented times certainly call for an unprecedented effort. So if you'd like to share this event with family or friends who weren't able to be here tonight, we will be posting a recording on YouTube, and we'll put the links in our website. And that officially ends our program. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight.